Good evening, everyone. My name is Rowan. I'm with Independent Jewish Voices. For those of you unfamiliar with us, Independent Jewish Voices is a national Jewish organization with chapters across Canada. We're a grassroots organization grounded in Jewish tradition that opposes all forms of racism and advocates for justice and peace for all in Israel-Palestine. About 10 years ago, we became the first national Jewish organization in Canada to officially support the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions campaign, or BDS, against Israel. A point that we're proud of, and we've been working on BDS campaigns with our partners in Palestine and around the world, including here in Canada, ever since. We encourage everyone to check out our website, which I'll be posting in the chat, as well as our social media in 1 minute. To briefly go over the tech, you'll see that there's a chat. I'd ask that everyone remain respectful. If you're not, I'll simply remove you from the chat, so it's in your own interest as well. And of course, if you have questions, we encourage you to put them in the Q&A section. If you have questions, please put them there, because if they're in the chat, they'll usually get lost. But if your questions go in the Q&A, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A after the speakers go through their first statements. And so without further ado, it's my pleasure to pass it over to Rima Burns-McGowan, who will be moderating tonight's event.
Thank you so very much, Rowan. Thanks everybody for coming. This is such an absolutely crucial conversation. And it's also, you know, it's a very difficult conversation. It's a very courageous conversation, if I may say so. And it's fraught because so many people come to it holding a lot of trauma. And so what we're going to try to do tonight is to unpack this very difficult question of what is anti-Semitism and how does it get used in the current political climate internationally and domestically that we find ourselves in. My name is Rima Burns-McGowan, and I am the Member of Provincial Parliament for Beaches East York. I'm also a very proud member and longtime member of Independent Jewish Voices, IJV. And I've been speaking and writing about these questions for a very long time before I was persuaded to get into politics by former students of mine. I taught diaspora studies at the University of Toronto, primarily the campus at Mississauga, but also the other two campuses as well. And it was actually former students of mine who said, you know, you have this really wonderful ability to frame how we get to an equitable society, one that works for everybody who lives in these lands. And so you need to have you should be in politics and talking about it on a sort of bigger platform than a classroom, although I love the classroom. So here I am. Foolishly, I took their advice. I'm an introvert, so this wasn't a natural fit. But when I get to moderate a panel like this, I feel like it's all worthwhile and it really lights up my heart. I do want to begin by acknowledging that we are all on Indigenous territories wherever we are in the country. And I'm going to talk about the particular piece of land that I am sitting on, but I invite all of you to think about what would that, how does that translate into where you are? So Beaches East York, the riding and the communities that I represent at the Ontario Legislature actually covers two different treaties. The Williams Treaty, which was signed with the Chippewas of Lake Simcoe and the Mississauga First Nations, and the Dish with One Spoon territory, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas. And I really do love the Dish with One Spoon territory idea, because the idea is that we all share the resources in peace and mutual respect and regard. And there are no knives in this territory. There's only a spoon. We have to share. And I think that that's the spirit with which we come to this discussion tonight. It's to really talk through these difficult issues and this difficult conversation and come to a place of greater understanding and mutual respect. I am absolutely overjoyed to be sharing the space tonight with three superstars. And I think you will agree with me that they are, beautifully positioned to be able to have this difficult conversation. I'm going to introduce them briefly, and then I'm going to explain, or let me just explain how this is going to work. Each of them is going to have an introduction where they set out where they're coming from, how they're approaching this conversation. And then, so that will be sort of roughly 10 minutes for each of them. And then we're going to have a little bit of a back and forth, and then we're going to open it up to a conversation that incorporates all of, your questions, your very thoughtful questions and concerns that you would like them to answer. So in the order in which we're going to hear everybody, we have Abigail Bakan, who is a professor in the Department of Social Justice and Education at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, and an affiliate with the Anne Tannenbaum Centre for Jewish Studies at the University of Toronto. Her research is in the area of anti-oppression politics, with a focus on intersections of gender, race, class, political economy, and citizenship. She is vice president of the United Jewish People's Order and a member of Faculty for Palestine and Independent Jewish Voices. With Yasmin Abu-Laban, she is author of Israel, Palestine, and the Politics of Race, Exploring Identity and Power in a Global Context. Sheryl Nestel, PhD, has been active on the Jewish left for many decades. She lived in Israel between 1974 and 1988. She received her PhD in sociology and equity studies from the University of Toronto in 2000 and taught there until 2012. She regularly teaches community courses on Israel, Palestine, and conducts anti-Semitism training to academic and community groups. She has been a member of the National Steering Committee of Independent Jewish Voices Canada since 2012. And Joe Roberts is a veteran political strategist in both the US and Canada, and currently serves as managing director at Jewish Currents magazine. An expert in public policy, he is the executive director of the Centre for Canadian Progress, Canada's only democratic socialist policy centre, founder of the Democratic Socialists of Canada, and co-host of the Canadian political podcast, New Left Radio. He spent the last 10 years in executive positions in the Jewish Federation system and calls London, Ontario home. And I have actually one more question for you. I know that it can be confusing because there's a chat as well as a Q&A, but I'm going to be looking at the Q&A in order to pose questions to our wonderful panelists. So please, please, please post your questions, not in the chat, but in the Q&A. That would be incredibly helpful. Thank you very much. And I guess I want to tell you just one small thing about me because it's not necessarily obvious from my name. I was born in South Africa. I come from a mixed background. So I am biracial. 3 of my 4 grandparents were born Jewish, and my paternal grandmother converted to Judaism to marry my grandfather. She was also biracial. The Burns in my name is actually Bernstein. And before that, it was Boltashinsky. And my great grandfather had to run away from the Tsar's army when he was 12 years old to escape persecution. My grandfather changed the name from Bernstein to Burns because of rabid anti-Semitism in South Africa by Afrikaners, and the little store that he'd managed to create was constantly being destroyed. So he changed his name to Burns. So that's just a little bit about me. And now I'm delighted to stop talking and to pass the mic over to Abigail.
Thank you very much, Rima. I'm really honored and privileged to be able to share this space and time with Rima, who is also my member of parliament. So I'm very doubly honored, and also with Sheryl and Joe. I want to thank the Independent Jewish Voices. Rowan has done a tremendous amount of work, Julia Barnett for inviting me, and all the work that has gone into creating important fora like this. I also just want to, in addition to the helpful acknowledgements, which we've heard already and shared, I just want to remind all of us that the reason we're on this unusual, now very familiar Zoom platform is because we continue to be in conditions of a serious pandemic. And for any of us doing research and writing, trying to share reflections, thinking about some of the horrific things that have happened this week and the week before, everything is harder. All the inequities in our society have been revealed and deepened. Many of us have additional care responsibilities, and though we're very fortunate to have access to vaccinations and to have a sense of something on the other side of this, we are continuing to be surrounded by disease and death. And it's in that context that we're trying to grapple with these difficult situations and questions. So the use and misuse of anti-Semitism can be addressed in a number of ways. And I want to really present some reflections on how I think about the term and the concept, and also an example from my own experience. So the term anti-Semitism, many of us know, is an imperfect one in many ways. There are many Semitic languages other than the Hebraic language, but it is the term that we have to use. And one of the meanings of it is anti-Judaism, which is a form of prejudice based on religion. It's very long-standing. But the issue of anti-Judaism means that you can convert in or out of your identity with the target of anti-Semitism. But that is not the case with the more common use, which is the second usage that I'll be addressing, and that's anti-Jewish racism. And like all racism, there are commonalities with other types of racism, and there are particularities about what anti-Jewish racism is. All racism is about divide and conquer strategies. All of them are about isolating groups of people based on sort of phenological or non-movable characteristics. There are unique racial stereotypes and tropes and codings. But racism is fundamentally about ascribed features which are inherent. There are terms like, blood that is used, or notions of birth. And from that perspective, anti-Jewish racism is an ascribed identity, which is one that you cannot convert in or out of. From the point of view of anti-Jewish racism, the concept is that if you are born Jewish, you will die Jewish, and you are the target of extreme and violent prejudice. And that form of anti-Semitism has never disappeared before. It has been moderated in various ways. It has changed a lot over society. Certainly the level of anti-Semitism that my parents or grandparents encountered on a daily basis is much more intense than what I have encountered on a daily basis, but it has never disappeared. And this situation has never been stable. But there's a third use of the term anti-Semitism, and this is a political construct sometimes referred to as the new anti-Semitism. It's a confusing and I think inaccurate use of the term. It's applied to basically any challengers of the state of Israel, and specifically the policies and practices of the state of Israel towards Palestine and Palestinians. And those who advocate for this definition have specifically traced it to the most recent period, some specifically to the World Conference Against Racism, the UN World Conference that happened in 2001. Now, there are currently, as I'm sure we know, several very powerful, highly resourced organizations that claim to represent the Jewish community and that are forwarding very aggressively this wrong-headed and confusing conception of anti-Semitism. It's not with the aim of overcoming anti-Jewish racism. It's not with the aim of overcoming prejudice or advancing Jewish human rights or human rights in general. It's not with the aim of advancing dignity or freedom of expression to oppose racial prejudice or to unite us with all those who are victims of racial oppression. Instead, this definition of anti-Semitism is to advance a certain political goal, the politics and practice of the state of Israel. My training is in the field of comparative political science. And from my point of view, and from the point of view of political science, Israel is a state, and it should be subject to all the same standards that states are subject to. But the political aim of this false notion is that the state of Israel represents all Jewish people, and that the political ideology of the state of Israel is actually comparable to Jewishness. It isn't. Instead, the political ideology is Zionism. And Zionism does address anti-Semitism, but it does it in a very pessimistic way, to assume that Jews and non-Jews cannot live in peace with one another. And the conclusion is that only if there's an ethnically defined political state that is specifically defined to advance the Jewish people will it be possible for Jews to thrive. Since 1948, with the founding of the State of Israel, we have something that I have called in my writing really existing Zionism. It's the Zionism of today, because Zionism has taken different forms. And this means that it became a majority or a hegemonic view in terms of dealing with anti-Semitism, but really only very recently in history, only really since the Holocaust and the refusal of Canada and many other Western states to admit Jewish refugees, where this pessimistic conception became much more dominant. Other strategies of dealing with the history of anti-Semitism that have actually been traditionally more dominant were when Jews and non-Jews fight together in common movements, in trade unions, in socialist movements, in labor rights, or in social and civil rights against the oppression of all peoples. So we need to challenge this false conception of anti-Semitism, and that's a complicated process because we have to find the language to do that and the clarity to do it. But we need to be extremely clear. There is a much longer tradition of Jewish ethics and solidarity and care that can point to solidarity with the Palestinian people and that can challenge the claim of representing the Jewish community by indicating the diversity of Jewish voices and also watching cautiously and opposing a coding for anti-Palestinian racism, which mobilizes the term anti-Semitism in its process. I'll give you a recent example of this. I work at the University of Toronto, which some of you might have heard is currently under censure from the Canadian Association of University Teachers, or COUT, because of a gross violation of academic freedom and academic integrity. An offer of a position to Valentina Azarova to become the director of the International Human Rights Program in the Faculty of Law was rescinded immediately following the intervention of a judge, an alumnus, and a donor who was also the co-chair of the center, former co-chair of the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, or CIJA, a well-known organization that advocates for Israel and a Zionist organization. So this is quite ironic. The position was withdrawn because the candidate, who was by far seen after a competitive search, the leading and most qualified candidate, writes in part of her writing in defense of Palestinian rights as human rights. That's it. That's the issue. That was the provoking issue that led to the intervention and led to the withdrawal of the position. Fortunately, my colleagues in the law faculty stood up, saw what this was, opposed it. An intervention, a report was given to be able to investigate it. A lot of material is available for this, but luckily the Canadian Association of University of the CAUT of university teachers responded by saying this was an unfair withdrawal of a position, and we are now under censure. So the censure is very welcome. It's a welcome development, but I am part of the community of faculty that have supported the censure of our own university. It's an unusual position to be in. Even the COUT censure, this is the third time in the over 50-year history that censure has been carried out. But we wrote a letter, we found each other as Jewish faculty, specifically to object to the way in which the notion of the Jewish community had been mobilized to object to the Azarova's appointment. So anti-Semitism, as anti-Jewish racism, is real and needs to be challenged, as do all forms of racism. And the way to challenge racism is with clarity, with solidarity, with unity, with strength, and to oppose divisiveness and to oppose the apologies for unjust, inhumane, and illegal activities of any state. And there is no reason why the state of Israel should be exempt from the same rules and ethics that we would expect of any state in on the planet that we live in. So there is more information about the Count Censure. I'll put teach-in is happening on Tuesday at York University. I'll put that in the chat so that people can see more about it. And thank you very much for your time.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much, Abigail, and you were bang on time. And I think what you had to say was so crucial in so many ways. And the one piece that I'll pull out to like just put an exclamation mark over is that I think that many people do not understand that some of our current understanding, because there are many, of the word Zionism are not the way that people have understood that historically, that there's been a real shift in it, in the meaning and in the common understanding of it. And that is something that is not always appreciated and I think is really important to take away. Over to you, Sheryl. Thank you. Sheryl, you're still muted, I think.
Okay, unmute myself.
There you go.
You think you would learn after all this time to unmute yourself. What I was saying was that I'm really happy to be with the panelists and with Rima, and I thank you very much for being willing to be on this this event with us. So I'm going to start. I struggled a lot about how to connect the recent events in Canada to what we're talking about today. So bear with me as I flail along here. So last Saturday, the Toronto Star carried a full-page ad with the headline, "Our appeal to Canadians, stand with the Jewish community in the face of anti-Semitism." So this ad was signed by dozens of Jewish communal institutions, was basically a complaint that Canadians are being reluctant to stand in, quote, solidarity with their fellow citizens who are under attack. So it was disturbing that this ad contained a lot of undelineated but alarming allegations of recent anti-Semitic events. Some of these incidents are verifiably anti-Semitic, despicably, and, you know, verifiably anti-Semitic. Some have yet to be proven as anti-Semitic, and some have been completely debunked by eyewitnesses and video evidence. And what we were left with is a very disturbing lack of clarity, which is a point I'll come back to. So what's clear is this ad and its claims were bookended and eerily illuminated by two momentous examples of Canadian racism: the discovery of the bodies of 250 Indigenous children buried near a former residential school in Kamloops, BC, and the violent racist murder of 4 members of a Muslim family in London, Ontario. The rhetoric of the anti-Semitism ad and its proximity to these two highly consequential events demands that we think critically about how anti-Semitism is being portrayed at this historical moment. Is it ethical, I would ask, in light of these recent horrors visited on communities that continue to endure systemic racism, for the institutional Jewish community to demand a national summit on anti-Semitism? And how accurate are claims that Jews are the most targeted group in Canada? If we ask ourselves why anti-Semitism is being foregrounded at this moment, it's difficult not to see that attempts to pivot the public conversation away from Israel's most recent campaign of violence and destruction to an alarm-laden conversation about anti-Semitism constitute a strategy of obfuscation that has been in place since at least the 1970s, when the concept of the new anti-Semitism arose, linking criticism of Israel and anti-Jewish animus. So some of the groundwork, and I'm going to talk about work that I have been doing this year, some of the groundwork for the current panic over anti-Semitism has been laid by the ubiquitous B'nai B'rith yearly audit of anti-Semitic incidents, which is highly quoted. It is taken as truth by many levels of government, by the press, by many organizations. So early this year, I began to research the audit after I encountered what seemed like a very disturbing anomaly. I always find anomalies very useful for kicking off research. So in their 2019 report on anti-Semitism, the US Anti-Defamation League, which is no paradigm of equity, and I won't go into why that's true, reported a total of 2,107 incidents of anti-Semitism in the US. including 1,127 cases of harassment, 919 cases of vandalism, and 995 incidents of assault, including 5 deaths. And the ADL audit states explicitly that it excludes criticism of Israel and anti-Israel demonstrations, for example, from being counted as anti-Semitism unless there is evidence of anti-Semitic intent. And that's a really important distinction. So the ADL 2019 audit encompasses a US Jewish population of 6.97 million people. And the B'nai B'rith audit, which I want to highlight, on the other hand, reported 2,207 anti-Semitic incidents in Canada, with 83% occurring online, and every tweet counted as one incident. In other words, the B'nai B'rith audit claims that an equal number of anti-Semitic incidents took place in Canada that year, despite the fact that the US has a population 9 times that of Canada and has 17 times as many Jews. So are Canadian Jews 17 times more likely than their American counterparts to experience anti-Semitism? How could this possibly be the case? And the answer lies largely in the methodological differences between the 2 audits. So the B'nai B'rith audit states that to delineate the parameters of anti-Semitism and identify its root causes, B'nai B'rith uses the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism. This, it can be argued, is the most significant underlying factor in this improbable disproportion between the ADL's numbers on anti-Semitism in the US and those reported by the B'nai B'rith in Canada. So while this IHRA WDA purports to be a tool for identifying and therefore reducing anti-Semitism, its focus on criticism of Israel appears to belie this intent. So the use of accusations of anti-Semitism as a strategy to suppress condemnation of Israel's apartheid regime has been promoted by the Israeli government for decades. Israeli Hasbara propaganda efforts intensified around 2007 in response to the founding of the Palestinian-led boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement and similar international forms of dissent. Since then, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism discourse has morphed from a talking point to a campaign to influence policy decisions and legislation around the world. A series of conferences organized by the Israeli foreign minister as the Global Forum for Combating Anti-Semitism has been increasingly focused on influencing foreign governments to adopt and strengthen anti-discrimination laws and on educating officials about the connections between delegitimization of Israel and anti-Semitism. And we saw here in Ontario that the IHRA was adopted, circumventing the usual political procedures, and probably because of intense political pressure. In 2019, the Israeli Minister of Strategic Affairs and Public Diplomacy was given a $35 million budget to combat BDS worldwide. And promoting the IHRA, WDA, was a key component of the strategy, and one that has been very enthusiastically embraced by B'nai B'rith and other pro-Israel organizations here in Canada. So to put it simply, harsh criticism of Israel, including calling it an apartheid state, a claim recently substantiated by the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem and the internationally respected Human Rights Watch, is considered by B'nai B'rith and those who endorsed the IHRA to be anti-Semitic. So B'nai B'rith counts expressions that speak to the racism of the Israeli state, its apartheid nature, or to political speech that endorses equal rights for all those who live in Israel-Palestine among the 2,000 plus incidents of anti-Semitism in Canada. So it's important to note that despite claims to the contrary, there is no Jewish consensus on the IHRA, and that's something that they try and encourage us to believe. In fact, there is an ideological battle within the Jewish world over what is and what is not anti-Semitic. Over 300 of the world's most distinguished Jewish studies and Holocaust scholars declared recently in the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism that anti-Zionism, in both its historical and contemporary forms, can reflect an ethical opposition to the concept of the ethnocratic state, as well as a commitment to equal rights for all those who live in Israel-Palestine. Consequently, they claimed, strong criticism of Israel, including support for the nonviolent BDS movement, should not be a criterion for judging when an action or expression is anti-Semitic unless there is proof of underlying anti-Jewish animus. That harsh criticism of Israel is included in what counts as anti-Semitism is not the only reason to question B'nai B'rith's claim that Jews are the most targeted group in Canada. academic studies and reports by advocacy groups confirm that racialized and indigenous people report hate crimes and discrimination at much lower rates than do white people for a variety of reasons, including these communities' victimization at the hands of police. Jews, on the other hand, and I'm not saying that all Jews are white, there are Jews, who are racialized as well, on the other hand, tend to report discrimination at much higher rates than do other groups. There are likely three reasons for this. One, there are dedicated and easily accessible community-based mechanisms for reporting anti-Semitic incidents. Two, Jewish organizations like B'nai B'rith and CIJA actively educate, encourage, and solicit community members to report incidents. And three, most Jews do not experience the kinds of systemic discrimination at the hands of civil authorities that would discourage them from reporting anti-Semitic hate crimes. So all of this certainly calls into question any claim of Jews being the most targeted group in Canada. What also goes unacknowledged in B'nai B'rith's reporting is that the percentage of police-reported violent hate crimes targeting Jews is far fewer than for other groups. While 16% of hate crimes against Jews were deemed violent, 40% of hate crimes targeting Black people and 40% of those targeting Muslims were classified as violent. So consistent and unimpeded reporting of hate crimes by racialized individuals and indigenous people would likely increase hate crime statistics significantly. This would also give a more accurate picture of who is being targeted and the nature of such attacks. Moreover, state violence against racialized and indigenous people is never documented in police-reported hate crime statistics and constitutes a hidden dimension of hate in this country. To be sure, this obsessive focus on anti-Israel incidents and their constitution as anti-Semitism deflects attention from the real threats to Jews in Canada, which, as in the US, appear to be emanating mostly from the white supremacist right. However, what is also disturbing is the divide that is created between Jews and other victims of racial hatred by what may be inaccurate claims to victimization. The B'nai B'rith audit portrays anti-Semitism as an exceptional and perhaps decisive form of hatred, thus unfailingly signaling a hierarchy of oppressions in which Jewish suffering trumps that of other groups. What is lost here is opportunity for solidarity across difference and transformative possibility of understanding how anti-Semitism and other forms of racism share some contemporary characteristics and historical origins, but also differ in their expression and impact. Jews and other marginalized groups need to consolidate our responses to racism, not fragment them. An honest accounting of anti-Semitism would be a good place to start.
Thank you so much, Sheryl. There's so much in there that's absolutely crucial for us to consider tonight and for everybody to take away, including the ways in which it is absolutely clear that the feelings about this topic Jews are so divided on the way that they feel about this, so divided, which is something that is not always appreciated. And that is a crucial aspect of this. My own research shows exactly the same thing. And also the points that you made about the way that reporting is uneven. Just today, in fact, I was speaking with Amira El-Gawabi, who was talking about the way that so many Muslims are terrified to report the kinds of hate crimes, small and larger, that come their way. Things that are short, obviously, of the horrific attack that happened in London. So yeah, thank you so very much for that. Joe, over to you. Looking forward to your thoughts.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for speaking ahead of me. I'm not an academic, so I will have a little bit less to say, I think, than the both of you, but excited to say it, and then we can jump into the conversation and the Q&A, which I think will be really valuable. So, like Rima, you might notice my name is Roberts, not exactly an Ashkenazi name, a traditional Ashkenazi name. I have a very similar family story. My family immigrated in 1905 from Lithuania into Boston, Massachusetts, and was actually living in the North Shore of Massachusetts. And there was an intense amount of anti-Semitism. My great-grandfather sold fruit from a cart and worked his way up from a peddler to selling produce wholesale, and actually took the name from Meyer Seidman to Mike Roberts to sound more white and less Jewish, so that he could do business with grocers in the area who wouldn't buy from Jews. So, that leads me to the first question, which is, I get asked this question, and my background, which I'll explain, I would get asked this question all the time: how real is anti-Semitism? How much does it affect us in the day-to-day? It's real. There is no doubt. There is no doubt that there is Jew hatred in the world. There's no doubt that there's Jew hatred in Canada. It manifests in a lot of ways. I myself, here in London, Ontario, have had anti-Semitic comments directed at me that were not related to Israel or Zionism, and it was just Jew hatred. Now, that being said, is it also wielded as a cudgel to silence criticism of Israel? Absolutely. And so we see this conflation, which Sheryl so eloquently spoke to, comes from this entanglement of Zionism at the central to Jewish identity and Jewish life that's been permeating for the last 40 to 50 years. Pre-1967, you didn't have this in Jewish communities, and pre-48, definitely you did not have this in Jewish communities. If you look back at the Jewish Federation movement, where I come from, and I've spent the last 10 years as an executive in that system in 4 different federations, it was not an anti-Zionist movement, but it was a non-Zionist movement until 1967. And really in 67, everything changed. And so what we've seen is, since 67, the dynamic has shifted. And this centering of Zionism and Jewish identity partially, I think, comes from a difficulty of the Federation movement to animate the Jewish community and to get people excited about Jewish life in a way, as we see religious identity declining across the West and people just not engaging in the same way. Israel is one of those issues that you can animate people on, right? One way or the other, people get fired up, they're getting engaged, they'll show up, they'll discuss it. And so it is often used as a tool to engage the community. But what that has done is also has placed the loudest voices, the most reactionary voices at the table to actually act on that and to push out dissenting opinion in many of our institutional spaces. And so what I've seen even in the 10 years in my time as a Federation exec was that conversation has become much more difficult, right? While at the same time, I think the tent is actually broadening. Our core of the Jewish community, the views are changing. We know that. The polling shows us that. We see that Jews are questioning more and more the actions of the state of Israel, want to engage in a dialogue, and are looking to our Jewish communal institutions to actually facilitate that dialogue. Right? If we claim to be the center of Jewish life, then it is our role, it is our obligation to facilitate that conversation. And what we're seeing is that often those voices are pushed out. And so you can look at the demographics very clearly of engagement in Jewish life. Young people under 40 specifically are far less engaged in Jewish communal life, both religiously and communally. And it mirrors relatively closely their views on the Israel-Palestine issue. And so when you ask them, why is that the case? They say, look, it comes down to a question of, I want to be able to have an open, frank conversation about Jewish identity and Zionism, and I feel like I'm not able to do that in Jewish life. It happens very regularly. And so we see that the number one concern of Jews, in my experience in Jewish communal life, is continuity, right? What will the next generation of Jewish life be? And so I think there's a battle raging around if we are centering ethno-nationalism as the center and core piece of Jewish identity, then we are pushing out young people who don't see themselves reflected in that frame of Judaism. And so how does this all manifest into anti-Semitism and the question of how that works and how it's utilized? I think that what we're seeing is, as those opinions change and as young people specifically ask more and more questions, it is easier to silence opposition by using this as a cudgel, right? To say any criticism of Israel, or even fair criticism of Israel, is anti-Semitic. That's not to say that there isn't anti-Semitic criticism of Israel. Of course there is. But there is also a weaponization of anti-Semitism by institutional forces to limit the conversation. And so we see that playing out. I think the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs was mentioned here. CJO was a agent of the Federation system in Canada, is an agent of the Federation system in Canada. They take direction from the federations, and yet they are guiding the direction when it comes to the conversation around what is anti-Semitic and what is not, as well as B'nai B'rith, who also receives funding from the Federation system. So it's not a democratic conversation coming up from who are the Jews around the table at these organizations and in our communities pushing up their view of what anti-Semitism is, or their view on the Israel-Palestine issue. It's coming from professionalized folks who do this every day, top down, and saying, this is the definition, this is what is anti-Semitic, and this is what is not. And I think that's where it becomes very challenging, is this lack of democracy and a lack of representation of views. You know, we talk about, I mentioned that CJ is funded by the Federation movement, and they're almost wholly funded by the Federation movement. At the same time, there are several other organizations that are doing Israel advocacy work, quote unquote, or work around Israel, Israel-Palestine, IJV, J-Space Canada. There's another organization on the West Coast that advocates for Third Way. None of them receive funding from the communities. None of them are given that same voice and are not centered as a spokesperson of Jewish community life. So it's really not representative of the Jewish community. And so we have a lot of work to do. And I think that this conversation is really critical to help us get there. So with that, Rima, I'll hand it back to you. We can go into the Q&A.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And before I take questions from the Q&A, which I promised to do immediately, but I guess my first question that I would like to pose to all of you, and thank you all, each and every one of you, because you've all come at this from, different interrelated and important starting points. And you've illuminated, each of you, various aspects of this very complicated and difficult conversation. And the question that I wrestle with is, how do we untangle this difficult mess from a place of love and caring that is actually productive and gets us to the place where we're having the conversations in society that we want to have? And it feels to me, as with so much, it's falling on the shoulders of people who are already exhausted and traumatized for many different reasons. We've all had to have complicated, difficult conversations in our own families. We're having them with people who are more or less dogmatic, more or less educated, more or less aware of the facts on the ground. So you're trying to educate people and have complicated conversations with them. I am sure that everybody who's Jewish, who's a part of this tonight, has had those difficult conversations. So as a society, how do we get, in your view, where we need to go? I'd like all of you to address that if you don't mind, and I don't mind who starts first. Any takers? Otherwise, I'll just point. Abigail.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to my co-panelists. This is just, it's really a privilege to be part of this rich and informed conversation. Thank you, Rima, for that question. I don't think there's an easy answer to this, but I do have a recent example that signaled something to me. So before the current events going on in my university were public and international news, there has been a concerted pressure to take the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism that Sheryl spoke about and make that policy in universities across Canada, including the University of Toronto. And a number of us, we didn't know how many existed. I had 2 colleagues at U of T who were Jewish and thought this was a problem. And we had 1 colleague at York who thought this was a problem. And we decided to write a letter and make a statement and see if we could get 5, maybe 6, maybe 20. We didn't know. And we carefully constructed a letter, which is now public at jewishfaculty.ca, of Jewish faculty voices against the adoption of the IHRA. And the way we wrote the letter was to draft it, to send it to people who we thought might disagree with our wording, and check it out and come back and then change the wording or adjust, but within certain principles. And we ended up with a letter that really was stating, some of us come from a place of Jewish ethical life. Some of us agree with BDS, some of us don't, but all of us feel that we will not solve the problems of anti-Semitism on our campuses by a definitional fiat. That the IHRA way of trying to deal with anti-Semitism and trying to stop a debate that is actually a debate within the Jewish community will not be done by organizational fiat. Anyway, at this moment, once we got up to 100 signatures, we thought this is historic. And now we're at about 160 signatures of self-identified faculty, many of whom have never signed a petition or been active on this issue before. And I'm giving that to you by way of an example, because I think one of the first things that has to happen is those of us who, however we self-identify as Jewish, whether we go to synagogue or not, whether we, are practicing or not, whether we honor the Shabbos or not, if we self-identify as Jewish, just like in any equity-seeking group, that means you're Jewish. And to say that you're Jewish and that you're against a certain definition of anti-Semitism, we have found that it actually has changed the conversation. That in small ways, the conversation can start. It won't change all at once. And as you identified in your opening remarks, and Joe was also talking about the question of engagement, that these are emotional issues, and even rational dialogue doesn't change an emotional place. People have to find their own way to this. But there is, I believe, a moment that we're in now where there is a sense that there is a bullying atmosphere, that there is a silencing, that it is not conducive to anything, even in liberal democracy, let alone the history of Jewish interpretation and debate, that says that we can't discuss this, and we should have the right to free expression about what we think anti-Semitism is and how we're going to deal with it. And in most forms of racism, we don't start with a definition. That's not how we tend to fight anti-Asian racism or Islamophobia or anti-Black racism. We don't start by saying we can't fight this unless we have a definition. We start by linking arms, because we know what justice is. We don't need a definition in order to be able to fight for that.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Sheryl, what do you think?
Yeah, I must say that, I totally respect this, that your request that we think about what we can do in gentle ways, in kind ways, because people like me and everyone else on this panel experience very little of that from the institutional Jewish community. It's very hard to reciprocate in that way. I want to say that it seems to me that we have a couple of things going on here. So this conversation is about anti-Semitism, but a big chunk of that conversation is that anti-Semitism has been weaponized, right? And it's been weaponized in the service of the Israeli state. And I think one of the things that really just keeps me up at night is the incredible obfuscation. I referred to the ad that was in the Star last week. The number of, I'll just call them lies, that appear in that ad are quite stunning. There is a line, there is a propaganda line that is adhered to and hewed to with incredible regularity. Despite the reams and reams and reams of research and academic evidence and human rights evidence about what's going on in Israel, there is still an absolute refusal to accept that. There's also something that's even more disturbing to me. I do belong to a synagogue. I belonged to synagogue for 30 years. There is basically a rule in the synagogue that Israel is not discussed. That there has to be the committee that determines what gets talked about in regards to Israel. It claims to represent the entire political spectrum, which it does not. But unless there's consensus on this panel, Israel cannot, no Israel events can happen. So of course, the outcome of that is that there's no discussion. It can't be discussed. We've tried to bring in different things at many times and constantly shut down. So there is this code of silence that hangs over everything. So you can't have, and then people like me, and I'm not even, I mean, I'm radical, but I'm not the most radical person I know, are regularly vilified publicly, and discredited. So those conversations simply cannot take place because anything out of the mouths of dissidents is considered to be fabrication. So you have this incredibly toxic dynamic going on now in the Jewish community, this code of silence that I mean, we can't even sit down across the table and have these discussions. So how will we ever learn how to be kind to each other about them? Particularly if the institutional Jewish community engages in vilification. IJV is known as, completely untouchable. We're like the untouchables of the Jewish community. We are not to be engaged with. We are not to be spoken of. I did a few interviews with the Globe and Mail in the last couple of weeks, and in one of them, it quotes B'nai B'rith and Simon Wiesenthal and Sija and etc. and independent Jewish voices, and I thought steam must be coming out of their ears at this point. So the fact of the matter is that we've made great progress in getting the dissident viewpoint out there, but the incredible hostility with which it's met, the incredible hostility which that is met in terms of the totally verifiable facts of Israeli violence and violation of human rights is a very, very difficult obstacle to overcome. So I've been cooking up a campaign that I hope that we will launch sometime soon, that I'm calling the Cheshbon Nefesh campaign. And in Hebrew, Cheshbon Nefesh, it's kind of a concept that comes out of the Yom Kippur atonement, context. And it's accountability, accounting, a moral accounting. And I think it's time for the Jewish community to be called to a moral accounting for their positions around Palestine. And then I think you'll see people return to the fold. You will see people want to engage. Young people don't want to engage because of the barriers. The barriers are enormous. The defensiveness is enormous. The obfuscation is enormous. And it's no surprise to me that young people do not want to engage. So I think that this is really destructive for the Jewish community in a lot of ways. This gatekeeping. So I think that we're a long way from having a kind discussion. A lot of things need to happen before that can even begin.
That's the unfortunate reality, and a really helpful set of thoughts. I think that from my own research, there are so many Jews who have so many thoughts and so many issues and have sensibilities that are closer to IJVs than they would ever admit to their friends and their family, their shul, their community, but they're terrified of getting screamed at. It's very scary. When I started speaking about these things, my father would say, I agree with you, but you have to say it out loud, because he was terrified for me, and for very good reason, for all the reasons that you're raising. Joe, I'd love your thoughts.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been giving this a lot of thought as of late. I wrote this piece in Canadian Dimension right after the conflict recently. And I was thinking a lot about this, and someone engaged me online and said, should we be boycotting Jewish institutional life, right? Is that an answer to this? And I actually think it's the opposite of that. I think in order to heal this, any healing takes some pain, right? In order to heal, you have to have a scar. That means you had to have been wounded. And so I think we have to open that wound first. I think we have to engage in institutional organizational Jewish life. We have to, people who have a dissenting opinion and who are concerned about these things, need to engage, need to go to, go to shul if that's your thing, if you're religious, or get involved in Jewish communal life in some way, whether it's a federation or whatever it might be. Because if your view is not voiced, if you're not there to say we need to wrestle with these conversations, which I think at the end of the day is the challenge, right? If you're in a self-referential echo chamber that never challenges your core beliefs, then the conversation will never move forward. And so in order to have an outside opinion at that table, to say, no, I have a different view. I think we have to engage in this, and we have to really, really talk about what this means for us, what this means. And I mean, when I say what this means for us, it's more than just, than morally. I think morally, for sure, as Sheryl mentioned, it's absolutely important that there's a moral question here. But there's also, what is the future of Jewish life? The continuity question, which I talked about. There's also the question of politically, what does this mean for us, right? I mean, we see that it's making for some very strange and terrible bedfellows, right? We see that we're aligning ourselves with ultra right-wing, white nationalists who believe in ethno-nationalism, not because they love Jews, but because they want it here for white people. And so that is really scary and problematic. And so I think we have to wrestle with all of that. And I say that out of love for the Jewish community. The reason I got involved in Jewish communal life was not because I wanted to work on Israel advocacy or that portion of the work. It was because I love community. I love the idea of people coming together around these shared concepts that are millennia old. That's beautiful. But in order to do that, we have to wrestle with the same questions we've always wrestled with, right? And this is not a new question. It's maybe verboten today, but it wasn't. My great-grandparents were Jewish labor bundists, right? They were anti-Zionist as part of their identity. They believed, my grandmother once told me, actually, that she said, my parents told me the state of Israel is a problem for us because ethno-nationalism will lead to fascism. And what does that mean, right? And so that was a conversation that we had in my house as a kid. And I didn't agree with him at the time. I had a very different viewpoint. But without engaging in an honest conversation, we'll never come to a place where we can agree, ever. It just won't happen. If we just don't start, it can never end, right? And so we'll be in this frame forever. And I think that is my biggest concern.
And I think that it's so key, this question of whether Zionism has to lead to ethno-nationalism, has to lead to a place that is antithetical, in fact, to Torah. I think that is actually so crucial to this. There are 25 questions in the chat. There's no way we can get through them all in half an hour. So I think what that says is that this conversation is an absolutely critical one and that there need to be many parts to it. But I'm going to start with a question that I think is related to where you just ended up. And it's the question that Avram Rosner has asked, which is do you believe that any definition of anti-Semitism which contains the word Israel, no matter what the context, is automatically flawed? Or not? Like, what do you think about that? Abigail, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just speak to this briefly because I know we want to make time for my colleagues and for all the other questions. But my own feeling is that I want to resist the definition game. That's my own feeling. The reason the definition phenomenon is upon us is because it has come from a concern that Israel is being too subject to public criticism. And that's where it's been motivated. So the IHRA definition, which as we know was originally meant to be a survey tool and not a universal definition, Ken Stearns made that clear, but it's being used as a weapon in order to be able to silence certain types of criticism of Israel. And the question, I think, is being, what the questioner is motivating us is to say, well, if we took Israel out of that, maybe we could get a good definition of anti-Semitism. And I think the Jerusalem Declaration goes some distance of trying to deal with that. But racism by its nature, if we are dealing with racism, is slippery, and it changes, and it's inventive. And those, if we really want to deal with anti-Semitism, those who are going to hate Jewish people are not going to be changed or altered by way of saying that that means you're anti-Semitic. And then they go, oh, sorry, I didn't mean that. That's not how racism works. Now, you know, you could say, are Jews really a race? Well, not necessarily, not always, but racism makes us a race. When you have the protocols of the Elders of Zion, when you have the claim of the Aryan race that those who have one drop of Jewish blood are an enemy to the survival of the human race, then we become a race. And that means we have to look to how people fight racism. We have to look to those who know how to fight racism, and definitions is not high on the list.
Absolutely.
Wise
words. Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, I think, look, this is a political question to me, right? It's not necessarily a Jewish question, right? It's a political question. The fact that we have to have this conversation, and that, you know, my colleague Mari Cohen at Jewish Currents wrote a piece kind of right after the ADL started releasing the statistics saying that anti-Semitism was going through the roof, and it doubled in the week after. And she said, well, first, I mean, the question around our editorial table was, how do you know that, right? How can you have done any investigation in a week? And it's really hard to say. Some of the things blatantly were not anti-Semitic, right? Someone saying from the river to the sea at a rally. You know, many pro-Palestine rallies were just included in as anti-Semitic incidents, right? But the question, for me, the issue is that we have to have this conversation based on that. They've won the political battle. They've framed it in this way. We have to react to, right? And even by reacting, you know, when Sheryl reached out to me, asked if I would be on this panel, I said, oh, you know, this is kind of scary, right? Are we going to be viewed as anti-Semitic for having this conversation about anti-Semitism? And so at the end of the day, it is a political question that's being framed in a way that draws all of this into debate. And questioning the actual core of it in and of itself becomes dangerous in the political environment. And so I think we have to keep that in mind as we have this conversation as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Sheryl, you're good? Okay, so here's another question, and I think this is picking up some of the threads in the chat as well. You know, so much of this, there is absolutely a calculated political element, as we've been discussing, but a lot of this discussion is also informed by sheer trauma, and it's intergenerational trauma, and it's trauma that we've heard from family members and community members. And that's true for everybody who's Jewish, wherever they are on the spectrum of thinking about this question. And for many people, events in Israel, Palestine exacerbate that trauma in different ways, because they trigger us in different ways. And my question is, how, and I think there are folks in the Q&A who are trying to get at this, like, how do we respond to the fact that right-wing anti-Semitism is also growing? Terror of anti-Semitism is there and grows along with that in this political environment, and with all the tensions that we've been talking about. Sheryl, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm very interested in this notion of trauma and how it's deployed. You know, we're getting very close in Canada to having no living Holocaust survivors. So, you know, the actual generation that experienced that is no longer with us for the most part. What we do have in terms of trauma is, what could be called a produced response. The reinforcement of the trauma narrative on the part of the institutional Jewish community in Jewish schools, day schools, weekend schools, in Holocaust remembrance, and I'm not going to be popular for saying this, in Holocaust remembrance events, works very hard to reinsert trauma into people's psyches. There is something, I think Joe kind of alluded to this, that, this is a way of keeping people engaged. So, there is even something that absolutely horrifies me, this idea of epigenetic trauma. The trauma is actually physically inherited, that some Jews are speaking of. I think we have to be really clear about where ideas come from. Trauma is something that is learned. It is something that gets reinforced through hegemonic narratives of various sorts. And the Jewish community, sadly, is very good at using this tool. I think that it is what keeps any critical conversations about Israel, and even critical conversations about the Holocaust. I mean, every year I look at the Holocaust Remembrance Week thinking, okay, what can I go to? What can I see? What's going to be interesting for me? And inevitably, there's nothing there that interests me, because there's nothing there that engages with the most, some of the incredible critical thinking that is going on now about the meaning of the Holocaust, including, looking at the Holocaust in the context of imperialism and colonialism, what was learned from what, which colonial regimes had brought, to bear on the Nazi regime. When are we, so it's all seems to me, and maybe I'm jaded, to be designed to to recycle the trauma, to make the trauma apparent, to make, there's an interesting, the movie, oh dear, just, I can't remember the name, Discordia, which was made about 10 years ago. And it's a very interesting scene. It's about the anti-Semitism industry. And there's a group of Jewish kids from Israel who are brought to Germany to go to Auschwitz. It's part of their last year in high school, right before the army experience. And there are 3 kids sitting there. There's a lot of emotion going on. They're at the, they're at the site, the Auschwitz site. And one girl is sitting there and she's very disturbed. And she says, I don't know what's the matter with me. I can't cry. Everybody else is crying. I can't cry. There must be something really the matter with me. So, the fact, this question of the produced response, there's a way you're supposed to respond. And that is the appropriate Jewish way of responding. It keeps us from seeing things differently. And I think that it concerns me that we say, oh, we're traumatized, therefore we cannot respond in a thoughtful way, in a rational way. I think that some of that traumatization is a produced response and comes from the kind of educational and ideological material that we see coming from the Jewish community.
And that's a really important set of ideas to think about. And I just want to insert, before Joe and Abigail continue, that when I am referring to trauma, I don't only mean trauma from the Holocaust specifically. I mean a much bigger picture. Some of my family members did perish in the Holocaust, but for me, trauma comes from a sense of being constantly moved and forced to move, and having a teeny tiny little family because of the way that so it's a much bigger issue than the Holocaust specifically. But I totally take your point, and I think it's a really important piece to hold. Joe, Abigail, would either of you be willing to address this?
Okay, yeah. So thank you, Abigail. Yeah, I think for me, I don't want to diminish in any way the trauma, because I think it's very important. I think I think it's a generational difference also, though, right? And so we see that reflected. We see, I'm 36, my peers and those younger than me, when I talk to them in the Jewish community, and when I worked with them in young adult groups within Jewish life, and we would talk about these things, they'd say, it doesn't feel real to me. It's not my experience, right? I don't see anti-Semitism in a day-to-day. It's not something that enters my mind. It's not something that I deal with on a regular basis. For people who are older than that, I think it's a very different experience, right? You couldn't live in certain neighborhoods if you were Jewish, right? You couldn't join certain clubs. You couldn't go and work at certain law firms. I mean, there were very real ways that anti-Semitism affected daily life. But I think that generational difference plays out in differing views of this issue. And again, it comes back to that conversation. If we're not having honest conversations about what that means and what those lived experiences are, we'll never be able to come to terms with them.
Thank you so much, Joe. Abigail, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to approach this from a slightly different perspective. I mean, I think I'm not a trauma expert, and I don't, and I think the phenomenon of Jewish trauma is real, but Black people live with daily violence every day in the courts and the police. I mean, we just, the George Floyd moment was transformative, not because it was new to Black people, but it was new to white people to see that public lynching videotaped. The phenomenon of what Indigenous people experience it's not just the residential schools, it's daily today. And I don't doubt that there are experiences, and I've encountered some, not a lot, where Ashkenazi Jews are subject to violent anti-racism or the continual, microaggressions that happen on a daily basis that can be absolutely debilitating. But the way we usually deal with these types of things is that we have a scholarly, academic, or secular conversation in daily life to be able to deal with it. We're dealing with truth and reconciliation, and we're seeing transformation in our universities where we're talking about curriculum and pedagogy at every level. The phenomenon of Israel-Palestine is almost undiscussable in normal, secular, scholarly life. It's almost undiscussable. And for those of us who try to teach in this area, it's extraordinarily difficult. I mean, our students don't know how to talk to one another. Often teachers get silenced, parents call people up, students walk out of the classes. The language is a challenge for people who are working in, first, second, third languages, and where the language of, Israel presents itself with a Jewish star on its imperial colonial apartheid project. It is not a surprise that many people who have only met a Jewish person on the other side of a violent bayonet think that there is an association between the Israeli state and Jewishness, and they hate it. And that hatred finds a way to be expressed. So we have a complicated reality here. Even the UN World Conferences that try to deal with the global picture against racism, not only in 2001, but the previous conferences that happened, Israel walks out when the word Palestine gets put on the agenda and says, we're not going to discuss racism anywhere in the world if Palestine gets discussed. So we have this phenomenon, which then leads back to the hegemony of exactly what Sheryl is talking about, that there is a particular, I learned this in my synagogue, or I learned it at my, B'nai B'rith event or whatever, or they learned it from their grandmother. But we need to have some type of a scholarly, secular conversation about these things. And we are fighting for that. Many of us are fighting for that. These types of fora are a feature of it. But it's not easy. There's a lot of punishment and a lot of restrictions. When I have students who want to study in this area, we have to have a couple of conversations. One is, what is your original work and what do you want to do? And the other is, what do you want to do with your PhD, or your educational doctorate? Because the conditions are not easy. That doesn't mean that, people are changing. It's not a reason not to study in this area, but we have a lot of barriers to get over in order to be able to bring that out.
Thank you so much. And speaking of barriers, and again, apologies to everybody who's asked a really great question that we're not going to be able to get to tonight. But the one that I do want to pull out is Samuel Mickelson's, and he writes to Abigail's point about bullying behavior by mainstream Jewish institutions and individuals. How can we as Jews respond to allegations of anti-Semitism when we express criticism of Israel, or even the framework that they have put out there as a way to consider these topics? This is a really tough one, and everybody wrestles with it. And I know a lot of people stay silent because it cuts deep.
I don't know. There's not an easy answer to this question. And I think, I saw the reticence on everybody's face to answer it. Look, I've dedicated the last 10 years of my life to Jewish community. And when I ask these questions or make these statements, I get the same response. So I don't know. It's not something I figured out how to deal with myself. And I think it's I think it's the only thing I found to do is to be level-headed and calm and, stick to the facts and say, this is the situation, and then talk about personal experience. This is why it personally hurts me, right? I wrote this piece in Canadian Dimension. I didn't talk necessarily about all the statistics and things like that we can all find anywhere. I said, this is my experience and this is how I feel. And I feel complicity for this, and it's painful, and I don't know what to do about that. And that's reality, right? For me, it's true. And you can't argue with that, right? You can't tell me, no, you shouldn't feel that way. And I think that's really the only way, connect on a personal level and make it personal and about feelings is the only way to really have any productive conversation about this in any meaningful way.
Thank you so much. Abigail, Sheryl?
I think we all grapple with this, and I know that I didn't start researching and writing professionally about Israel-Palestine until I was quite senior in my professional development. And even so, I mean, yeah, there's a sense of silencing, but the Palestinian people don't have a choice about whether to resist occupation and dispossession and anti-Palestinian racism. And that's what inspires me. That we need to be in solidarity, and we need to disconnect from the claims that Israel speaks for us. And that's a reasonable ethical position to take. And if other people then turned around and they say, you're not really Jewish, or you don't know what you're talking about, I mean, we can't control that. We can't control what other people are going to say, but we do need to find community. We do need to find support so that people don't feel so isolated. I think the fact that, for those like Sheryl and others in IJV who've worked very hard to maintain the institutional integrity of this organization, I think that's a big part of that kind of support. But I do also take heart in the fact that I think that type of bullying, I mean, what we teach our kids is the bullying comes from weakness. It doesn't come from strength. If there was confidence in a difference of opinion, we would just sit down and rationally have a difference of opinion. The only reason there are these types of silencing and intimidation tactics is because that's all there is. That's all there is. And I take heart by looking at the long view with history, the same history that Joe and Sheryl have talked about. And Zionism doesn't figure as the totality of Jewish life. It's been a minority position historically, and it comes from pessimism. You know, it's one of the reasons I think there's this focus on these exaggerated numbers about anti-Semitism, which is a ridiculous thing to do. If you're suffering, why do you want more? You know, like, why are we trying to make it look worse than it actually is? Why can't we try to, you know, look at the points of solidarity, look at the points of brotherhood and sisterhood, look at the points of unity that have held up our community across, you know, Jewish and non-Jewish alliances. There are many examples of them. You know, so, but Zionism needs the pessimism. It needs to say, see how terrible anti-Semitism is. It's been the same for, you know, thousands of years, and the only solution is make Aliyah, live in Israel, be here with the protection of the Jewish state. And those two things can be challenged together.
Yeah. The notion that it is born of pessimism as opposed to hope and optimism and solidarity, and not in fact out of the beauty that is Torah and Tikkun Ha'olam is I think a very important one. Sorry, Sheryl, please go ahead.
No, I was just gonna. I totally agree with what Abby is saying here. I think one of the things that's important, and I'd like people to hear me out on this, is that the idea of having a community of people who will support your dissident opinions and tell you that it's okay is really, really important. I think that many people tell us that, who come to IJV, and they say, thank goodness I have found a community where I can feel at home. And I'm just going to make my plea that we need more of you to join the community, to gain courage from being in community, and to speak out. The more people speak out, and sometimes it's baby steps, and sometimes it's more, you know, bolder things, bolder steps to take, but the more it becomes clear that the position that the institutional Jewish community is taking is not shared as widely as they would like, the easier it's going to be for all of us to speak out and to be heard. So, you know, this is my plug to join IJV, contribute to IJV. You know, we are carrying this battle forward, you know, on a shoestring and a wing and a prayer, and a lot of dedication. So I think that we need bigger numbers. We need a critical mass. I think we're getting there. I think it's actually there under the surface. And I think that, you know, this, as I said, I told you about this campaign I want to start, and I'm hoping, you know, one of the demands of the campaign is to demand that your communities have these discussions, that your schools have these discussions, that your synagogue has this discussion, that the JCC has this discussion, that, you know, and then you will find others who, you know, who you can make common cause with. But please, you know, try and figure out ways that you can express yourself and become, you know, part of the group who's trying to challenge the silencing.
So, and I want to sort of lead off that and then tie in another question that's in the chat from Sid Schneid, which is, so when you find yourself feeling this way, do you, I mean, Sid's question is, you know, how can we do this work when official Jewish institutions hermetically seal us out of their facilities? And he's speaking from experience here. So when you feel yourself kicked out, is the answer to say, well, fine, I'm just going to find community with people who are like-minded at IJV? Or do you kind of insist on your right to stay within a shul or a community that has said, we don't want to hear that here, and you force them to have that conversation? How are we supposed to navigate this? And, you know, his question is related to another one he had for you, Joe, which is, you know, how do you survive as an employee of Jewish federations given the politics, when it's all connected, these questions? So over to all of you. I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Well, I'll jump in so I can answer that second question. And I actually have strong feelings about this. I think, you know, as Canadians, we don't always like confrontation. Confrontation is going to happen. in this. It's the only way. And if it doesn't happen organically, then we actually have to force it to happen, because it's not, without that confrontation, like I said, without opening the wound, we can't heal. And so I think we have to force ourselves into these rooms. We have to be active, even if we're not wanted. It's uncomfortable, right? There's no doubt. Like if they don't want you there and they make it known, you have a right to be there. It's a Jewish communal space, right? I think that, some ways you can force yourself in the room, make a small donation. They can't kick you out if you're a donor, right? I mean, it's true. These are things you can do. And then do it with friends. Don't do it by yourself. Find somebody else that you know, or people that you know, and say, we're going to do this together. We're going to make it so that they have to listen to us. And not yelling outside the door, which they're used to, and they're able to say, well, those are crazy people outside the door screaming, but do it in the room where they have to respond. And then how did I do this? It's interesting. It was a transition for me. I didn't start out as a leftist on this issue. I was, progressive except Palestine, I think. And I made a lot of excuses for the state of Israel. And I tried to reconcile it in my head, and it didn't work always. And then it's actually funny. I've been to Israel, Palestine 26 times with my work, many, many times. And every time I went, I saw things that I hadn't seen before that created more questions for me. And I think the real shift for me was seeing a checkpoint, actually being in front of a checkpoint, which ostensibly the funny thing was we were there to do a tour of the border wall, not to see the checkpoint, but the checkpoints are there. And so right behind us, while Colonel Danny Terza, who was the architect of the border wall, was talking about how great of an achievement it was, I'm watching people, just regular people, trying to live their lives and trying to get, IKEA bags through the checkpoint. And it was an epiphany for me. I never was able to look at it the same way again. It's interesting, after I wrote that piece, I got a lot of people responding to me saying, it was very brave of you. And I actually I feel like it was cowardly of me in a lot of ways, that I couldn't speak up while I was there in the same way. I definitely pushed from inside, but when your livelihood depends on it, it's a different scenario than when it doesn't. And so, it's, couldn't do it anymore.
Thank you so very much. Maybe, Abigail, if you don't mind going, we'll give the last word to Sheryl, since we're about to be over time.
Yeah, I'll just say that I don't think there's a one size fits all for how we have these conversations. I think, Jews are no stranger to debate. We look for debate. We have debates, all of us from our families, I'm sure, Pesach dinner, oh my God, there's no stranger for debate. So we should be actually quite good at having these conversations. We should know that you can have a big row and even yell and scream, and then you hug each other and, you have a good meal and life goes on. We should be good at this, but we need to practice starting with the ethical reality that the Israeli state is extraordinarily violent and is a settler state that is dispossessing hundreds, thousands of Palestinian lives. If we're going to deal with truth and reconciliation here in Canada and recognize the history of indigeneity, we have to recognize that Israel was not a land for a people without a land. It was inhabited, and the inhabited population needs to have the right to return. And we need to separate that out from what we are talking about when we're talking about Jewishness. We need to know that the state is one thing and Jewishness is something else. And we have this intersection. It's like a Venn diagram of a state that claims that it's a Jewish state. But all the political parties in Israel, all the major political parties are Zionist. And Zionism is like an ism, like socialism or communism or anarchism. And we should, I'm trained as a political scientist. We should be able to discuss this and learn from it. And, the Jewish tradition is also a tradition of learning and interpretation. So if we approach this as something that is welcoming and positive, we can get through the other side of this. Rima, you were talking about your background, and I remember, the anti-apartheid movement against South Africa, and I was a young activist, and I did not really believe that I would ever see the fall of apartheid. And it's not to say that, there aren't changes that we still need to be made and so on and so forth, but societies do change, and they change in ways that you sometimes think are not possible. And I think Israel-Palestine will change, and our responses around it will change, and we will get to the other side of this. I am not predicting a timeline. I don't want to minimize what we have to do to get to that, but I do think there's a vision of a better world, and debate is a way to get to it. It's not the way to back off from it. It's the way to get through it.
I love that. I love that with every fiber of my being. Thank you. Cheryl, over to you.
I don't want to break the spell after Abby said that, but I want to pick up. I'll finish here by I'll pick up something that Joe said, and he talked about how what his turning point was, and I'll tell you what mine was. Even though I went to Israel to live in Israel, I was radical. I don't think I really understood exactly what the history was, and I came to understand it later. But when I left because of the first Intifada, and I used to say I don't want to be the master of a million Arabs, that's why I left. And it took coming here to really open my eyes to what the problem was, and that was that Palestinians are invisible in Israeli society. That it took me being here for a while to say, none of the things that I witnessed in Israel, people having different color license plates and being stopped on the highway, and, 1,000 other examples I could give, would never be tolerated here. Never. I mean, obviously we live in a racist society. We've had very good evidence in the last few weeks of that. But, there are certain kind of liberal principles that people, particularly the Jewish communities, who are always, advertising their liberal principles around, even around indigenous rights, etc. But cannot, as Abby said, cannot seem to apply the same moral and principles to the Israel-Palestine situation. And I think that, part of that is anti-Palestinian racism, which is extremely deeply rooted in the Jewish community. And it's time for us to say there needs to be consistency. These principles apply across the board. They apply to Palestinian human rights of every kind that we can name in this country and elsewhere, and that that we can no longer excuse, the failure to see the violations. There's no excuse for it, and it has to end, and we have to move forward to something, that is moral and equitable and more rooted, in Jewish tradition and principles of justice in general. So, I'll just leave that there.
Thank you, thank you, thank you so much. I think that we all agree that at the core of, well, I don't know if we all agree. For me, and maybe for many, the need to live an ethical life is at the core of what it means to be Jewish, or a Judaic life. It's so crucial, and we can only get there if we have these conversations. There's no way through it, but through it, debate, it's going to have to be. There are 30 odd questions that we didn't manage to get to, although some of them combined in different ways. So IGV, thank you so much. Cheryl, Joe, Abigail, thank you so much. Thank you to the many, all of you who came to yet another Zoom session at the end of a long day of Zoom sessions. And I think this is just a crucial conversation, and we clearly need very many more of them. So thank you so very much, everybody.